listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.
The Life and Prayers of St. Luke, written by Wyatt North, narrated by David Glass. Foreword. Nearly every detail about Luke the Evangelist's life has been the subject of heated debate. The scholars of one era have provided explanations that entirely contradict the scholars of an earlier era. It's not as simple as a matter of religious tradition versus modern scholarship. Tradition contradicts tradition. Scholarship contradicts scholarship. Scholarship contradicts tradition, and sometimes tradition and scholarship go hand in hand. Despite the debate, no singular conclusion seems to be available. It does not help that more of St. Luke's life is shrouded in darkness than is available to us, even when taking into account the most controversial suppositions about him. That makes the quest for St. Luke very difficult, but it's important that we try to find and to understand him nonetheless. He is, after all, a man whose work has influenced millions of people, and it is through him alone that we know several of the most popular parables of Jesus. The Life of St. Luke. Introduction. The lives of the saints, written down over centuries long gone, are often filled with great detail of exploits and dialogue. The level of detail is not vast compared to what we are used to as moderns, but to the historian familiar with documents of similar age, the details are extraordinary. Sometimes the accounts are so detailed that it's hard to imagine that they were written purely historically in the way that we write history today, without the aid of divine inspiration. We might then be forgiven if we assume that the authors of the New Testament are intimately known to us, perhaps not to us personally, but to someone else. Their names and a sense of who they are has been passed down to millions of Christians for 2 millennia, from the modest believer to the Pope himself. Their images adorn churches the world over. Yet, for all the time that man has spent studying their words to better understand Christ's mission and the will of God, very little has been written about the people themselves. Even the evangelists, who can seem so near, are quite elusive. Of them, none is quite so elusive as Luke the Evangelist, the presumed author of both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, the traveling companion of St. Paul, the first painter of icons, and protector of doctors and artists. Nearly every detail about Luke the Evangelist's life has been the subject of heated debate. The scholars of one era have provided explanations that entirely contradict the scholars of an earlier era. It's not as simple as a matter of religious tradition versus modern scholarship. Tradition contradicts tradition. Scholarship contradicts scholarship. Scholarship contradicts tradition, and sometimes tradition and scholarship go hand in hand. Despite the debate, no singular conclusion seems to be available. It does not help that more of St. Luke's life is shrouded in darkness than is available to us, even when taking into account the most controversial suppositions about him. That makes the quest for St. Luke very difficult, but it is important that we try to find and understand him nonetheless. He is, after all, a man whose work has influenced millions of people, and it is through him alone that we know several of the most popular parables of Jesus. In our quest for Luke the Evangelist, however difficult it may sometimes be, we do not merely meet a saint, we also gain insights into the Gospels, the early church, and the makings of the New Testament. For 2,000 years, countless writers have made mention of St. Luke. It would be impossible to enumerate them all, but most of the discussion has concerned the content of his writings rather than the man himself. Even in those sources that concern themselves with Luke the evangelist, the author, the physician, and the companion of St. Paul, the information given is incredibly sparse. One can easily be misled by the number of sources, for most of them are tremendously short. It's almost as if to his contemporaries, St. Luke was not very important, merely reporting the story, and the men who later cared for the story of the man himself then had very little contemporary source material to work with. Luke's own writings, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, are not forthcoming with details about their author, although some hints may be found in the saint's choice of phrasing and parables. Luke is also mentioned in passing in the letters of St. Paul, specifically the Epistle to Philemon, the Epistle to the Colossians, and the second Epistle to Timothy. The oldest source that deals with the life and also the death of St. Luke is an anti-Marcionite prologue. This is a collection of short introductory paragraphs about the Gospel writers, composed between the late 2nd and late 4th centuries, and found in several dozen Latin Bibles. They are called anti-Marcionite because they exist for all evangelists except for Mark. The prologue about Luke is the oldest and was composed in Greek sometime in the late 2nd century, then amended with an extra paragraph in the 4th century. This means that some of the earliest information that we have on the life of St. Luke was not written down until a full century after the end of his earthly life. Contemporary with the later changes of Luke's anti-Marcionite prologue are the writings of Eusebius of Caesarea, a Roman historian and bishop of Caesarea, northwest of Jerusalem. His famous church history makes mention of St. Luke and briefly verifies some of the traditions concerning Luke's home and profession. Eusebius was probably a source for the writings of St. Jerome, who wrote a few decades later. Jerome's Lives of Illustrious Men is a collection of biographical notices on famous men, and it contains a biography of St. Luke consisting of a few short paragraphs. St. Luke also appears in the In Argumentum Evangelii Secundum Lucam of the 9th century Irish writer Sedulius Scotus. Although its late date, the text probably reflects a much earlier tradition, as Sedulius was primarily a compiler using earlier texts, such as the writings of Origen, a 3rd century theologian who wrote commentaries on Luke's Gospel that now exists in fragments. The 13th century bestseller of sorts, The Golden Legend by Jacobus de Voragine, contains perhaps the longest life of St. Luke. Unfortunately, Jacobus de Voragine spent more energy on telling us about the good morals of the saint than on telling us even the most basic details of his life events. The most complete life of St. Luke is probably the one given by Simeon the Metaphrast in his Menologion, also known as his Synaxarium. This biography of St. Luke has been dated from as early as the 9th century to as late as the 14th century, but most scholars believe that it was written down in its final form during the 10th century. Many more have made brief mention about aspects of Luke's life in commentaries of his writings. The origins of an evangelist. No part of St. Luke's life is so shrouded in mystery and hidden from us as the early years of his life. It was established as fact already in the 2nd and 3rd centuries that Luke was born sometime around the birth of Christ in the city of Antioch, a large and flourishing metropolis in Roman Syria. The earliest surviving mentions of this tradition comes from the anti-Marcionite prologue and the church history of Eusebius. It is a claim that is considered quite reliable by historians, as it is consistent across the early sources, and it dates from a time when the information may actually have come from someone who knew Luke personally during his earthly life. Although his place of birth is known, it is impossible to say who St. Luke's parents were, what social standing they had, and even what ethnicity and religion they called their own. Most scholars believe that St. Luke was born a pagan. The earliest evidence towards this comes from St. Paul. Although Paul does not explicitly say that Luke was a Gentile, someone who's not a Jew, when he mentions Luke in his epistles, he lists Luke with those of his companions who were uncircumcised, and thus not Jewish. Luke himself never speaks of his own ethnicity, but scholars believe that hints can be found also in Luke's writings. The fact that it is only in St. Luke's Gospel that the parable of the Good Samaritan is recounted, along with several others highly positive to Gentiles, is often cited as an indication that Luke himself was a Gentile. Before we weigh this particular piece of evidence, we must remember that Luke was also a companion of Paul and greatly influenced by his teachings. St. Paul, of course, was very positive towards Gentiles, despite being a Hebrew himself. So Luke did not necessarily have to have been Gentile to choose parables that bring Gentiles into good graces. The early sources outside of the Bible do make direct reference to the ethnicity of Luke. The anti-Marcionite prologue tells us that he was a Syrian by race, as does Eusebius. This could mean many things, and most modern sources will tell us that St. Luke was, in fact, Greek. This is because Syria was captured by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, and ruled by Greeks until it became a Roman province in 64 BC. Although the province was under Roman rule at the time of St. Luke's birth, the language of the ruling class remained Greek. Given that Antioch was the capital city of both Greek and Roman Syria, this indicates that Luke was born into a culture that demanded that he was versed in both Greek language and Greek customs. But the Antioch of Luke's day was very superficially Greek. The Semitic pagan gods were still worshipped, and the native language of most inhabitants, not the language of the administration, but the language spoken in the home, was Aramaic. If Luke the evangelist was in fact a non-Greek Syrian living in the metropolitan pseudo-Greek culture, that might explain why he was so well versed in Greek, while still having many of the Semitic-sounding idiosyncrasies that scholars have noted in his writings. Aramaic is, after all, like Hebrew, a Semitic language. Unfortunately, the evangelist's name is of little help to us in determining his origins. The English form Luke comes from the Greek name Lucas. Naturally, a Greek name may indicate a Greek ethnicity, but that is not necessarily the case in these conquered lands, where many people had both a native name and a name in the language of the conquerors. Lucas may simply be Luke's Greek name used for business in Greek, or it may be a name that was chosen for him when he converted to Christianity. In addition to his Greek or Syrian ethnicity, Luke may have been a Roman citizen. Not all men in Roman cities were citizens, but there are those scholars who believe that he was. If he was born into a family with some means, it is quite possible that he was a Roman citizen. Unfortunately, the social status of Luke's parents hinges on our understanding of his profession. The earliest sources tell us that Luke was a physician. Indeed, St. Paul himself refers to Luke as the beloved physician in his epistle to the Colossians, chapter 4, verse 14. In the past, scholars have believed that this means that St. Luke was born into a rich family who could afford to educate him. There is also a tradition of viewing Luke the Evangelist as a tremendous scholar with a talent and thirst for knowledge. Simeon the Metaphrast tells us that Luke studied not only in Antioch, but in the finest schools of Greece and Egypt as well. When he had studied all of the sciences, Luke turned to philosophy, and only then became a doctor. Since the late 19th century, many scholars have reevaluated this traditional view of St. Luke as a scholar and a member of the upper classes. Further study of ancient source material, unknown in the Middle Ages when the tradition was established, has taught us that physicians in the Eastern Roman Empire were not necessarily men of means and stature. In fact, they were often slaves. What does this mean for Luke the Evangelist? If St. Luke were born a relatively rich man, he was probably afforded a fine education. Antioch was a large city with fine teachers, and Luke could very well have received his education. If his family was very rich, Simeon the Metaphrast may well be correct in his assertion, and Luke may very well have traveled for his education. It was not unknown at the time for men of fine families to travel to the famous educational centers of Greece in order to receive schooling there. Adolescent males from all over the Roman Empire were sent to Greece in order to study in the cities where the great philosophers had studied and taught, not entirely unlike how many wealthy Americans have sent their children to study at academies in Paris or Rome and to absorb the culture in the centuries leading up to our own. It is, however, unlikely that he would have traveled all over the ancient world in order to complete numerous educations, quite in the way that Simeon the Metaphrast describes, unless he was a very rich man with a very understanding father who did not in any way require him to contribute to the running of a family business, to marry for the sake of alliances, or to otherwise participate in the family's life at Antioch. We can't take Simeon the Metaphrast entirely at face value without asking the question, what man in a pre-industrial society can afford to send his son into the world as a perpetual student? A tremendously rich man who has several elder sons, perhaps, but why, then, would the sources be quiet on Luke's extremely wealthy conditions? If he had much money to give to the Christian cause, it must have been noted by those around him and be worth remembering. And if he left an incredibly luxurious life in order to live a modest Christian life, then that would be all the more noteworthy and a much greater moral gain for the Christian cause. Secondly, we must ask if such a rich and probably famous man who traveled the known world looking for knowledge and wisdom would really have had a profession. The earliest sources, even St. Paul himself, identify St. Luke as a physician. If he was incredibly wealthy and studied all of the known sciences and humanities, why would he be identified as only a physician, and a working one at that, especially given the generally low regard that physicians were generally held in at the time? There were the occasional wealthy and respected physician who ran his own clinic, but most of them were slaves, freed slaves, the children of freed slaves, and other lower-class non-citizens. The first medical schools were just opening up at the end of St. Luke's life, so most physicians were self-taught or taught through apprenticeship, and while some were true herbalists and surgeons, many more were unreliable quacks, peddling snake oil on the streets, giving doctors a bad name. Luke the Evangelist was definitely not one of the latter. Linguists who have studied the writings of St. Luke tend to come to the conclusion that he was an educated man, even beyond just basic literacy, which was not a given at the time. He has a wide vocabulary, and he uses medical diction and metaphor as well as scientific knowledge in his writings. He does not, however, possess the rhetorician's or the philosopher's finesse, which tends to negate the tradition that he was a great international scholar. But it does imply that if St. Luke was born a slave, he was afforded a proper education by his owners. That raises the question of how he came to be free to join St. Paul. But it is not implausible that he would have been freed if he were a slave. We might also ask, if he was born free into the lower classes, who could have afforded to pay for his education? Freedmen, though lacking family wealth, could of course gain considerable wealth through business. That business may even have been a medical practice. If St. Luke's father was a lower-class non-citizen who ran a successful business, he could possibly afford his son a moderate education and perhaps had him working in the family business as a physician. The scholars who interpret St. Luke as a man of Hebrew origin tend to follow the gospel commentaries of Theophylact of Orid, who in the mid-11th century considered Luke to have been a Jew and a student of Jewish law. They also look to the Semitic-sounding phrasings that Luke sometimes uses, and his apparent knowledge of Hebrew traditions. They suppose that he had a very privileged Israelite upbringing in an increasingly Greek family. We have already considered a possible response to Luke's Semitic phrasings, and his apparent knowledge of Judaism could bear an intimate relationship with Paul, or even other sources that he encountered in writing his gospel. If he were in fact so privileged and merely chose the title physician because medicine was his favorite science, we must also wonder why his writings don't make him appear more educated. Did Luke have a conversion experience? There are some discrepancies in the early sources about when in his life St. Luke first came into contact with the teachings of Jesus Christ. There is one tradition which states that St. Luke was one of the 70 disciples that Christ sent before him into the communities that he planned to visit in order to announce the coming salvation. This tradition was established at least by the 3rd century, when Hippolytus of Rome, a theologian, compiled his list of the 70 and chose to include St. Luke. That same tradition places Luke in Jerusalem on the day of the Passion, and among the disciples whom Jesus visited after the resurrection. Origen, writing in the early 3rd century, also states that St. Luke saw the things he reported rather than had them reported to him. Contrary to this tradition, most scholars believe that St. Luke did not know Christ during his earthly life. It seems unlikely that one of Christ's disciples should include a Gentile from at least 300 miles away, at a time when the ministry was not clearly separated from Judaism. The idea that Luke the evangelist did not know the earthly Jesus is also consistent with another early tradition. The anti-Marcionite prologue tells us that St. Luke had become a disciple of the apostles. If the author meant to say that Luke had known the earthly Jesus, he would clearly not have marked him specifically as a disciple of the apostles. This interpretation seems very likely given the evidence found in the Acts of the Apostles. Now those who had been scattered by the persecution that arose because of Stephen went as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, preaching the word to no one but Jews. There were some Cypriots and Cyrenians among them, however, who came to Antioch and began to speak to the Greeks as well, proclaiming the Lord Jesus. The hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord. Acts chapter 11, verses 19 through 21. If St. Luke was living in Antioch at the time following the martyrdom of Stephen, that is to say after 35 A.D., he would have been among the first non-Jews to be converted to Christianity. The community that he would have been welcomed into was one of mostly Hebrews, but because of the persecution against them and the inclusion of Gentiles, these early Christians would have chosen to congregate away from the synagogue and share a meal, the earliest version of the Holy Communion, at a believer's home, while praying and learning more about the Messiah. Luke was probably around 35 to 40 years old at the time of his conversion. The reader who is intimately familiar with the details of St. Paul's conversion will probably pick up on the fact that this means that St. Luke came to Christianity not long after St. Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, which turned him from a persecutor of Christians to a Christian himself. The two men were also of quite similar age. It's easy then to start imagining similar conversion scenarios for them. In reality, their experiences are likely to have been worlds apart. St. Paul was a Jew who became a follower of Christ through an apparition of the resurrected Messiah and a divine miracle. St. Luke was a pagan who became a follower of Christ, presumably through exposure to proselytes and discourse with them. Had Luke come to Christ through apparitions and miracles, it seems likely that they would have been noted somewhere, not the least because Luke himself wrote intimately about St. Paul's experience. As we compare the two conversions, the experience of St. Paul on that fated day on the road to Damascus when he saw Christ, Paul's experience may seem the more intense of the two. In an emotional sense, it must have been, but it is unlikely that Paul saw it as a great conversion. He was a Jew who continued to believe largely as he had been, except that he now recognized the truth that the awaited Messiah had come. St. Luke might not have been touched by a vision of Jesus, but he probably went through something much closer to what we consider a conversion experience. St. Luke was a pagan, a belief system that, due to its inherent polytheism, is generally not threatened by having multiple religious affiliations, near exclusive devotion to a certain deity, or initiation into several mysteries and truths. The monotheism that St. Luke turned to, however, demanded an intense break from his pagan way of life. It permitted him only one truth, one affiliation, one deity, one set of mysteries. It also initiated him into an ancient set of ethnic laws, ruling his behaviors, his diet, and even had expectations of a foreign bodily mutilation, circumcision. St. Paul experienced none of that. Paul changed his viewpoint on a certain set of very important tenets, but Luke became like an immigrant in a foreign country, especially if he, like so many other Gentile Christians in Antioch, chose to separate himself from anyone who is not a Christian for purity and simply for credibility, being an uncircumcised foreign outcast in his new community. Neither St. Paul nor the other evangelists use nearly as many words relating to conversion in their writings as Luke does in his Gospel and in the Acts of the Apostles. Unlike the case of many early Christian converts, however, the conversion of St. Luke does not appear to have torn his family apart. The earliest source outside of the Bible, the Anti-Marcionite Prologue, claims that St. Luke was unmarried and had no children for all of his life. No other source gives us any reason to doubt this, although St. Luke was probably a pagan for at least the first 35 years or so of his life. Being unmarried at that age would not have been unheard of, especially not in the higher classes. But he was certainly pushing an age at which it seems strange that he would not have been married. Later sources, such as Jacobus de Voragine, proclaim that St. Luke was a virgin in both mind and body throughout his life, although it is not impossible that St. Luke remained a virgin his whole life. As a pagan not seemingly inclined toward philosophy, there is a distinct lack of motivation for him to stay celibate.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.